Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Nathapada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje Chaitanya Chandra Charitamrita Shuddha Sindhu Vrindavaniya Surasormim Samunna Magna Jevai Jagan Nijagunai Swayamapunanti Tan Vaishnavangscha Harinama Parannamami Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano
Recording in progress.
Iha Viharati Radha Krishna Kunjadikari Tarubhaya Rasarite Shuddha Siddhanta Dhari Sakala Sujana Geya Krishna Dasa Bidheya Paramakila Gunanam Kaviraja Kavinam Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Hoilo Morachita Jeva Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Chaitanya Charit Krishna Upajibe Priti Janibera Serariti Shuni Le Borohoit Shriyatam Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Giyatam Mura Chintyatam Chintyatam Bhaktash Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, nourished by Sri Rup, Sri Sanatan, and Sri Raghunath, a most graceful swan in the inexhaustible reservoir of Sri Chaitanya Lila, where from the very essence of Krishna Lila streams in the 10 directions, Sri Krishna Das, Kaviraj, Goswami Pad. Again, today we will continue our discussion of Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. And today we're continuing discussion of the Sanatana Shiksha, the chapter on Abhidheya. And specifically now we come to a prakaran about Sadhu-sanga. So in our last discussion, we finished the section about the qualities of Vaishnavas, or sadhus. We listed 28 qualities as well as other qualities mentioned in other verses. And then we had this transition verse which mentioned both the qualities of Mahantas as well as the significance of both service to Mahatmas as well as the association of the asat. So that verse forms the structure for the next two sections. First, a section on Mahat-sanga or Sadhu-sanga, and then a section on Asat-sanga. So first, we have a section about the importance of Sadhu-sanga, which will go for a few verses, and then its opposite, the necessity of avoiding Asat-sanga. So we'll begin today from Payar 83, which brings up or speaks specifically to the importance of Sadhu-sanga. So, I will dive in. The tippani states the following: only association with bhaktas of Bhagavan is to be done. Thus he says Krishna. He speaks the first half of this payar. So, a very well-known statement in praise of Sadhu-sanga. Krishna bhakti janma mool hoy Sadhu-sanga. Krishna prema janme teho punamukya anga. The root of the appearance of Krishna Bhakti is Sadhu-sanga. And that, namely Sadhu-sanga, is furthermore the primary limb in the appearance of Krishna Prem. So in gist, what is being referred to here is that the quote appearance of Krishna Bhakti means someone initially taking to the path of Krishna Bhakti, or the first appearance of Krishna Bhakti into the life of that person. And then, after that, if they take to that path and they aspire to follow the path of Krishna Bhakti and achieve Sadhya Bhakti or Krishna Prem Bhakti, then the primary limb or the primary feature of that sadhana is also Sadhu-sanga. So Sadhu-sanga is the thing that brings one to the path and the main thing that enables one to progress and reach the goal of the path. These are the 2 points made. So we'll look at a few comments related to this and then the main verse which is cited to substantiate this. So, derived from the Sanskrit root sanj, which in a general sense means to adhere, the word sangha carries 2 primary meanings: association, in the sense of meeting and interacting, and attachment, in the sense of fondness and desire. So the word sangha, in context, as we'll see in the coming verses, carries both of these meanings and is sometimes used in one way, sometimes used in the other way, and sometimes used to cover both. So it's significant to understand. In other words, it's not just that all mention of sadhu-sanga refers only to just being in the presence of a sadhu, but also it conveys the importance of having, quote, attachment to the sadhu. In other words, to have great affinity, great fondness, a great desire for serving the sadhu, for following the teachings of the sadhu, etc. So sadhu-sanga is both general, proximity or interaction or association, and specifically attachment. So when we speak of sadhu-sanga throughout this prakaran, for the most part, both aspects are to be understood when the term is used. So the tippani elaborates on the meaning of the payar as follows. Sadhu-sanga means sangha with bhaktas of Bhagavan. Krishna Bhakti manifests as a result of sangha with bhaktas. Therefore, sangha with them is to be done. This is the purport. Furthermore, Krishna, that is, to further explain the importance of sadhu-sanga, he speaks the second half of the payar. Krishna Prem manifests as a result of association with bhaktas, therefore, that is to be done. So, a very straightforward restatement of the meaning, but probably helpful just to be clear, or at least to show that the interpretation I'm giving is grounded in the work of this commentator, not just my own. So, to evidence the first point made in this payar, that the root, that is the cause of the appearance of Krishna Bhakti, is Sadhu-sanga, Srimad Mahaprabhu again cites the following verse from Srimad Bhagavatam, which he cited earlier in this chapter, to evidence his statement that inclination for Krishna manifests as a result of sadhu-sanga. Bhavapavargo brahmato yara bhavet janasya tarhyachuta sat-samagama sat-sangamo yarhita daiva sadgato paravareshe tvai jayate rati. When the cessation of worldly existence shall come about for a wandering person, then, O Achyuta, with association with the Sat shall come about. And when association with the Sat shall come about, only then does inclination manifest towards you, who are the shelter of the Sat, or alternately, whose shelter is the Sat, and the master of the higher and lower. So, we discussed this verse already. We went through a comprehensive commentary that summarized all the different elements in the verse. And now, we're going to look at even more commentary on this verse. So, the initial commentary gave us a general overview, but Jiva Gosvami goes quite deep on this subject and brings up many significant points related to this subject. So now we're going to go into more detail, which in the process summarizes, how and why Sadhu-sanga is described now as the cause of the appearance of Krishna Bhakti. So, fundamental discussion of this verse was presented in the commentary following its earlier citation in verse 43 of this chapter. Relevant specifically to this verse's second citation here, as evidence for the principle that the cause of the appearance of Krishna Bhakti is Sadhu-sanga, is Sri Jivapad's discussion of this verse in Bhakti-sandarbha, where he endeavors to further establish the conclusion that intentness upon the paratattva in the form of unconditional, akinchana, that is, pure uttama bhakti, is the principal abhideya of the Shastra, by raising the following question. How can intentness upon the paratattva in the form of direct bhakti, known as akinchana or unconditional, which is constituted of a supremely rare essential nature, and is a supremely rare to attain goal, come about? So he's, at this point in the Bhakti-sandarbha, done very elaborate analysis to establish why bhakti is the abhideya, and we went through the gist of that earlier in this chapter. So then, for those who come to this understanding that the ultimate thing that the Shastra is enjoining for everyone to do is bhakti, then immediately someone is going to want to know, well, how do you get it then? Where do you get this bhakti? Or how do we acquire this samukhya, which is the seed form, if you will, of bhakti? If that's what it's all about, then how do we start? How does this path come into our life? So, he addresses all this as follows. To address this aforesaid question, he indicates the primary cause of intentness in general, bhavapavarga brahmato. He cites and discusses this verse. When for a wandering, that is transmigrating person, the cessation of material existence shall come about, that is, shall arrive at its time for occurrence. Pardon me. Then association with the Sat shall come about. In this regard also, when in actuality it is to be said, when association with the Sat shall come about, then the cessation of worldly existence shall come about, the statement is made in the verse in reverse, with the intention of causation, that is, of showing that association with the Sat is the cause of the cessation of worldly existence, and because of swiftness and compulsoriness in this respect. That is, the reversal in expression is also made because Sat-sanga is both compulsory for the cessation of worldly existence to come about and swiftly causative thereof. Therefore, this expression is an instance of the fourth type of ornament known as hyperbole, or atishayokti, according to literary aestheticians, alankarikas. It is said in the explanation of this type of ornament, quote, the fourth type of hyperbole is that which is a prior statement of an effect to articulate the swift effectiveness of the cause. The same is stated by Sri Bhagavan to Nala Kuvar and Manigriva in the Bhagavat 10.10.41, quote, as a result of the sight of sadhus who are of equal mind and thus of self-dedicated to me, no bondage shall remain for a human being, just as no bondage shall remain for the eyes as a result of sight of the sun. So he cites a verse of the Bhagavatam, which in one sense says the opposite of what this verse says, if you take it literally. This verse is saying when you see sadhus, then there's no more bondage. But the verse that we just read says, when there's no more bondage, then you'll see sadhus. So it appears to be the exact opposite. So what he's showing is that they're actually saying the same thing, even though they literally say the opposite. Because the first verse is an instance of a particular literary ornament in which something is said in reverse to convey the swiftness of the effect. So, the cause in this regard, that is, in regard to Sat-sanga leading to the cessation of worldly existence, is that when association with the Sat shall come about, only then does inclination manifest towards you, namely Bhagavan, the master of the higher and the lower, come about. And it is inclination towards Sri Bhagavan that leads to the cessation of worldly existence. The meaning is that at the end, that is the termination of the beginningless existent absence of the existence of awareness of Him, which is the cause of obliviousness of Him, awareness of Him, which is the cause of intentness upon Him, manifests. So I know that sounds quite of a roundabout way of speaking in English. Technical philosophical expression of Sanskrit sometimes can be a bit difficult to read comfortably in English, but essentially all he's saying is that ignorance or darkness ends when light comes in. So this beginningless absence of awareness ends when awareness begins. And when that awareness begins, then there becomes this intentness or this, focus upon that which one is now aware of. So, in other words, you don't know, and then the sadhu comes and tells you. It's not actually that complicated. It's just expressed in complicated terms. But what he means to say is that people who don't know and have been beginninglessly existent in this present absence of awareness, that ends when a sadhu comes and brings the awareness of Bhagavan or the Paratattva to them. So, he refers to this in more detail. Therefore, it is said by Sri Vidura, quote, certainly blessed devotees of Janardana roam about here in this world for the sake of favoring persons who by destiny are oblivious of Krishna, non-dharmic, and severely suffering. Here in this cited verse, quote, by destiny means because of past karma, and non-dharmic means devoid of Bhagavad Dharma, that is, devoid of bhakti to Bhagavan, as a result of absorption in that is, in past karma. So people, they're absorbed in their karma, they're unaware of Bhagavan, they're suffering. So, these blessed bhaktas, they roam about the world and end that by bringing about awareness of Bhagavan, since the absence of that awareness is the cause of the perpetuation of these people's suffering. Because of the mention of the structure when and only then, tada eva, in the base verse under discussion, the emergence of inclination towards Sri Bhagavan occurring without a delay in time, and therein, because of the word only, eva, its occurring not at any other time is the meaning. So in other words, these persons who are oblivious, they will remain perpetually oblivious until someone who's not oblivious ends their oblivion. So only then, and right then, that end of the oblivion happens. With that, the cause in regard to inclination towards him, this looks like there's a mistake here, come about, indicated by the description of Sri Bhagavan, is as sadgato. I think that should be coming, sorry. With that, the cause in regard to inclination towards him coming about is indicated by the description of Sri Bhagavan as, quote, sadgato, meaning, you the attainment, that is revelation of whom, occurs there wherever the sat come together. So this is quite a clever interpretation of this compound, sadgati, which are two words which are quite common and have a quite wide range of meaning in Sanskrit. So you could go in many directions with this. So he's taking sat here to refer to bhaktas, and then goti as attainment, which is a meaning, not the most common meaning, but one meaning, and then referring to attainment as spurana, which means, an appearance into one's conscious awareness. So then he's saying that Bhagavan is this sadgati, or he is this thing that, or object that reveals itself or appears wherever the sadhus are present. So goti or spuran, or the appearance of him, happens where there are the sat. This is how he's interpreting it. And to give strength to his interpretation, he cites a statement to this effect from the Itihasa Samuchoy. Quote, Vishnu is fully present there where devotees of Vasudev, meaning Vishnu, free from worldly attachment and so forth, are present. O king, there is no doubt in this regard. Thus, in this way, even in cases in which Sat-sanga is not said to be obtained by someone who is said to have acquired inclination towards Bhagavan, recent, former, or indirect Sadhu-sanga must be inferred to have occurred. So this is a strong statement of Jiva Gosvami. This is the main point he wants people to understand, is that in every case there's always Sadhu-sanga in the trajectory of any jiva with anadi avidya eventually achieving samukya, or eventually achieving moksha, or eventually achieving prema. So when we read the Shastra, even if every single account given in the Shastra doesn't include the detail of when and where and how that satsanga took place, we will understand that it must necessarily have taken place, but wasn't always narrated. So in some cases we have narrations that highlight in particular the satsanga that took place in the life of people, like Rahugana meeting Bharat Maharaj, or Chitraketu being visited by Narada, or things like this. But in other cases, we don't necessarily find specific mention of such sadhu-sanga. So therefore he says that either it happened recently, it happened in a past life, or it happened indirectly, but it happened. This is what, like, as an overall principle, he wants to establish. The verse under discussion thus clearly evidences the point made in the previous payar, that the cause of the appearance of Krishna Bhakti is Sadhu-sanga. That is, it establishes Sadhu-sanga as the sole cause of the appearance of Krishna Bhakti in a jiva bound in samsara. After giving the aforesaid explanation, however, Sri Jivapad raises a challenge to the aforesaid conclusion. So now we're going to go into some, step-by-step subtle analysis. So you could leave it at that. The payar is simply saying the cause of the Krishna Bhakti coming into someone's life is Sadhu-sanga. And here's the Bhagavatam in multiple places saying that when people got Sadhu-sanga, then they got Bhakti. It's said in the 10th canto, here it's said in the Sadhur Puran, it's implied in the verse itself by the word Sadgati. But Jiva Goswami wants to, refine our understanding of this, or adjust it with things that are said elsewhere. So he raises the following concern. In this regard, an attainment of that nature, that is, of inclination towards Bhagavan, like that of Sri Nalakubar and others who attained inclination towards Sri Bhagavan by the grace of Sri Narada, or other bhaktas of Sri Bhagavan, on the part of devatas, such as Indra, and others, even those who saw and so forth, that is, and otherwise associated with Sri Narada and others, that is, and other bhaktas of Bhagavan. It rolls smooth in Sanskrit, but it seems a bit clunky in English. But these categorical placeholders are ultimately important, so I always preserve them whenever rendering something. Is not heard of in the Shastra. So what he wants to say here is that, okay, you say that Sadhu-sanga is the cause of attainment of samukya, and you say that it only happens because of Sadhu-sanga, and you say it happens right when Sadhu-sanga takes place. That's your statement. But we see so many cases of people who had Sadhu-sanga, but no samukya. What about Indra? What about these devatas who met so many rishis, who had the host of honoring and having so much association with highly learned persons and great bhaktas of Bhagavan, but they didn't become bhaktas like this? So your claim that Sadhu-sanga swiftly produces samukya isn't always true. So there has to be something else, some other causative element here. What is that? This is the Purva Paksha, if you will, or this is the concern raised. So the query raised here by Sri Jivapad is that if association with bhaktas like Sri Narada is said to swiftly cause the attainment of inclination towards Sri Bhagavan, and if Indra and various other devatas who are known to have had the association of Sri Narada and other bhaktas of Bhagavan are not seen to have acquired inclination towards Sri Bhagavan like Sri Nalakuvara did, then why did these devatas who had such association not attain such inclination? He addresses this query as follows. This is to be assessed as follows. When the presence of offense, aparad, exists in a person, then for them, that is, those who are devoid of regard for the Sat, and those who see only ordinary piety and so forth in them, because of that fault, that is, because of their past offense toward the Sat, the assistance of the grace of the Sat is required for the sake of eliminating that fault, that is, that offense, even though general association with the Sat, wherein the Sat do not necessarily bestow their grace upon someone with specific intentionality, is in general the cause of intentness upon Bhagavan. So, in gist, he's saying, generally, this is a principle, where when someone gets Sadhu-sanga, they will get Sammukhya. But, if the particular person who has Sadhu-sanga has their psyche polluted by the consequences of having committed aparad in the past, then the effect won't happen in the same way. So, what was said before holds, but in general. And there are exceptions because of the characteristics found uniquely in certain recipients. So to clarify this, he says, when there is inoffensiveness in a person, then for those in whom highly elevated vision of the Sat, that is, high regard for them, has manifest just by association with the Sat, simply association with the Sat, wherein they do not bestow their grace upon someone with specific intentionality, or they may, but he's saying they don't have to have, is a cause of that. That is of intentness upon Bhagavan, even when there is an absence of mental attentiveness in them. That is, even when the Sat are not specifically attentive to those inoffensive persons, or when such persons are not attentive to the Sat. The way it's written, you could interpret the compound either way. So he's saying that if someone's not offensive, then when they meet a sadhu, they'll be impressed. There won't be anything inhibiting that impression. So the effect of that impression will swiftly be effective, and some mukhya towards the paratattva will come about. But if there's an inhibitor on that, as a result of having committed aparad, then that same effect won't take place in the same way. So he goes into more detail about this. Thus, referring specifically to those possessed of offense, it is said by the Ajanaja Devas in the Bhagavad 3.5.43, quote, O Supreme Isha, O you of highest praise, they who sustain a connection with the beauty of the movements of your footsteps, that is, your bhaktas, generally therefore do not look at they who are of inner mind perturbed by senses beset with unwholesome functions. So he elaborates on this. This verse is explained as follows. They who sustain a connection with the beauty of the movement of your footsteps, meaning your bhaktas, generally do not look at them, meaning do not make them an object of their glances of grace. Who are they whom the bhaktas generally don't look at? They who are of perturbed inner mind. That is, they who are oblivious, bahirmukha, literally out-facing, with respect to Bhagavan. So the bhaktas, who are sammukh, who are always attentive to, ever thinking of Bhagavan, they're generally not looking over to, they're generally not casting their attention towards those who are bahirmukh. And who are not only bahirmukh, but who have had their inward-facing cognitive functions carried afar, that is, turned outwards. In other words, person's capacity for being attentive to the higher reality, that capacity has been redirected by the senses beset with unwholesome functions, that is, offensive actions. So because people are involved in various activities in the world, their capacity for being attentive to Bhagavan or attentive to the Paratattva is not utilized for that purpose, and rather is carried by the senses out into so many external affairs. This explanation is to be considered here as well. So this is a cryptic reference to Sridhara Swamipad's explanation, which is as follows, and which differs from the one given above because the variant, quote, drawn away, is found in place of the word perturbed, and the subject and object of the verse are interpreted in the opposite manner. So certain statements in certain genders can have the same case endings as both subjects and objects, or as both, in the nominative or the accusative case. So in this case, you have pronouns that can be read as either subjects or objects. So Jiva Gosvami interprets it one way, Sridhara Swami interprets it the opposite way. Both are completely grammatically acceptable. So he takes it like this: O Supreme Isha, O you of highest praise, they who are of inner mind drawn away from you by senses beset with unwholesome, that is, externally focused functions, certainly therefore do not see, they for whom beauty is the movement of your footsteps. So Samipad says the Bohirmukh people, they're not going to pay attention to the sadhus. And Jiva Goswami says the sadhus are not going to pay attention to the Bohirmukh people. So for a good reason. One is Antarmukh, one is Bohirmukh. Why would they pay attention to each other? In other words, they're interested in opposite directions, opposite objects. Here, the state of being beset with unwholesome functions of the senses in general is not accepted as the meaning, because of everyone's functions of the senses being such prior to receiving that is a bhakta's grace. So he's saying, if you take this phrase, what is the phrase? Sorry, where is it? What is the actual statement? Asat. Okay. So he's referring to this word asat vritti. So asat would most crudely, literally mean not good or, bad activity. So does that mean bad activity in general, or does that mean something specifically that's classified as what we call offense? What does that refer to? So he's saying that we can't interpret it as just asat in general, or just preoccupied with the mundane, or just preoccupied with the ephemeral, or just something that's conventionally sinful. Because if you did interpret it like that, then that would imply that, well, here I'll just read it. He explains, the state of being beset with unwholesome functions of the senses in general is not accepted as the meaning, because of everyone's functions of the senses being such prior to their receiving a bhakta's grace. So if you say that people remain like this, then it implies that that's how everyone is. So there wouldn't be anything unique, or there wouldn't be anything to distinguish the significance of what's being said. So because the aforecited statement, quote, certainly blessed devotees of Janardhan roam about here in the world for the sake of favoring persons who by destiny are oblivious of Krishna, non-dharmic, and suffering severely, would have no object. That is, would prove false if the unwholesome functions of the senses spoken of in Bhagavad 3.5.43 were considered to refer to unwholesome functions in general and not offenses specifically, and thus imply that bhaktas do not look even upon those who are beset with generally unwholesome functions of the senses yet are inoffensive. So he's taking one verse at the very beginning of a chapter, and then another verse 40 verses something later, and then saying we have to be careful how we interpret these two things so that there isn't a contradiction. Because on the one hand it says that the bhaktas are giving grace, or the sadhus are giving grace to the people who are bahirmukh. And then if you say that this asad vritti of the senses just means bahirmukhata, then you get a contradiction. So this asat vritti of the senses has to be something more than conventionally bahirmukata. It has to mean aparad. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a reason to say that bhaktas over here grace people and then over here they don't even look at them. So rather, they grace people in general, but they don't give specific attention to those who are offensive. So this is how he adjusts the two statements together. So continuing, he says, grace from the Sat certainly goes towards them in the case of their having unwholesome functions of the senses that are not offenses. Even in the case of inaction in relation to them, that is in relation to the Sat, somehow on account of inattention, there, that is inoffensive person's rightful inclination, that is inclination towards Bhagavan, shall come about just by means of association with the Sat. So, even if people aren't looking for it, so to speak, if they just happen to end up in the association of sadhus, and they're not predisposed against the positive influence or spiritual influence that this Sat-sanga can have, then the people can acquire samukya, just like that. When, on the contrary, the Sat being self-willed, that is, acting entirely of their own personal will, bestow grace upon even one who is offensive, that is, then inclination towards Bhagavan shall come about only for that one, that is, that person who the Sat have graced specifically and not for others, as in the case of Nalakuvar and the Devatas in general. So this is how he finally answers the question that this whole discussion started with, which implies, as it was observed that Sri Narada, by his own wish, specially graced Nalakuvara, and thus Nalakuvara became inclined towards Bhagavan, while other devatas like Indra, who on many occasions had met with and observed Sri Narada, did not acquire such inclination. So if people are not offensive, just by the presence of a sadhu they can acquire samukya. But if they have committed some offense, then they won't. Yet, the third level of analysis is that, but if the sadhu of his own or her own will blesses that person in particular, in other words, shows some special care, kindness, goodness, favor to that person, then despite the fact that they have an unfavorable mentality, they can still acquire this. So ultimately what's being said here is simple. It's simply saying that people who are neutral, if they become exposed, they can acquire the positive. People who are negatively disposed, if they're exposed to the positive, may remain negative. But if the positive shows special attention to the negative, then the negative can turn towards the positive. So this is how he explains why, yes, Sadhu-sanga is swiftly effective of producing intentness or samukya upon Bhagavan, though it doesn't necessarily happen in every case. Sri Jivapad's explanation here is that those who are free from offense acquire an inclination towards Bhagavan as a result of Sat-sanga, even if a sadhu does not intentionally grace such persons. Yet if a person's psyche is polluted by the effects of offenses, then Sat-sanga will not necessarily lead to a person acquiring an inclination towards Bhagavan, unless a sadhu intentionally of their own will graces such a person despite their past offenses, as Sri Narada did in the case of Nalakuvara and Manigriva. Sri Jivapad summarizes his discussion of this subject with reference to the verse under discussion and underscores the reasoning behind it as follows. Thus, Sat-sangas alone being the fundamental cause in this regard, that is, of intentness upon Bhagavan, in the form of bhakti coming into being, is established. That, furthermore, is befitting because of the impossibility of that otherwise coming about for those possessed of obliviousness of him based on beginninglessly existent non-awareness of him, more simply, anadi avidya. So if someone's oblivious, they're going to remain oblivious until something comes along and makes them aware. Objects at rest will remain at rest until acted upon by an object in motion. Moreover, there is a complete impossibility of attainment of intentness upon him by means of duties and the like, that is, and other forms of worldly action that are turned away from him, that is, that are not related to him, or performed without awareness of or intention upon him. So this implies even to other things enjoined in the Shastra, principally for the Karma Marg. Persons may have many sattvic qualities, they may observe so many of the duties given for their varna, for their ashram, for their jati, etc. But unless they get Sat-sanga, even those things will not in and of themselves ever necessarily lead to sammukhya. So you need the actual substance to make someone else aware of that substance. You need the awareness in the heart of someone who has it to bring it to someone who doesn't. Sri Divapad's point here is in gist that when persons who lack awareness of Bhagavan engages in activities unrelated to him, there is no means by which they can or will acquire awareness of him. It is only when they are made aware of him, that is, when their attention is drawn towards him by those who are aware of him, that is, by his bhaktas who are steeped in bhakti to him, that those who are unaware of him can acquire awareness of him. But Bhagavan himself, but does Sri Bhagavan himself not also play a role in those who are oblivious of him attaining attentness upon him? So now we go to the next level of analysis. Okay, no one will get awareness of Bhagavan until they meet someone who's aware of him. But isn't Bhagavan involved? How can we say that Bhagavan is also not involved in people becoming aware of him? Can't we say that he's the ultimate cause? So now we get into finer analysis. What is the role of Bhagavan in people becoming aware of Bhagavan? He's after all called Soprakash, or he who self-manifests. So won't we say ultimately it's him self-manifesting himself? Let's see what Jiva Gosvami has to say. This goes into some very nice discussion, which gets very much to the core of why Sadhu-sanga is so important. And also, for anyone listening to the Padyavali classes, this is something that came up in a discussion the other day, or as a passage that I was referring to. So, this is as follows. Now, the following may also be proposed in this regard. Quote, Bhagavan's grace alone is the primary cause of acquiring intentness upon him. Someone may say, in reply to this, it should be said, no, that too is secondary. So he's not saying it's not causal at all, but he's saying it's causal only in a secondary sense. That does not proceed independently towards those who are oblivious of him, even those among the oblivious who are afflicted by the difficult to bear and unending afflictions of samsara, because of the impossibility of that. So this is quite a statement for persons who may have, been raised in a, Abrahamic tradition. This is quite a different outlook. In other words, that even the severe, acute suffering of people in the world doesn't evoke Bhagavan's attention upon them. And why not? Because it's impossible for that to happen. Now you may say, what? Bhagavan is omniscient, isn't he? How can he not be aware? So, Jiva Gosvami here gives what you might call this nuanced, limited sense of omniscience, or not actually completely omniscient. How so? He says the following: the transformation of the heart, the form of which is known as grace, or you could call it compassion here, occurs only when the suffering of another touches one's own heart. Because of the impossibility of the touch of suffering, which is constituted of darkness, tamas, upon Bhagavan's heart, which is just like the impossibility of a luminous objects becoming covered by darkness, on account of the establishment in the Shruti of the jiva's distinctness from Bhagavan by virtue of Bhagavan's always being solely of the highest bliss in affection. that is, his being constituted of and having a taste solely for the highest bliss, and his being repellent of sin. Its appearance, grace's appearance there, in Bhagavan's heart is an impossibility. Put in more simple language, because Bhagavan's sole affinity and very nature is that of the highest spiritual bliss, and he is never subject to the influence of sin or any other aspect of mundanity which causes suffering, he has never had any direct personal experience of the suffering of samsara, and he can never become subject to experience of it. He has not, and he will not, experience what it's like to be a jiva. He's not a jiva, he hasn't been a jiva, he will never be a jiva. So, what it's like to be a jiva in samsara, he doesn't have direct personal experience of that. The suffering of the jivas in samsara can thus never directly, quote, touch his heart, and thereby evoke his grace upon those undergoing it. So this is, an interesting perspective. In other words, Bhagavan is steeped in his own nature, he's steeped in the very highest bliss. The suffering of people in the world is a product of tamas. It's not something of any profound relishability. So why would he, who's always absorbed in the finest of the finest of the finest, to the nth degree, have any direct experience of this tamas within samsara? He wouldn't. So what is it like to experience such tamas? He doesn't know. And why would he have to, since he's pure and loving in his every act, and the cause of experiencing such tamas or suffering is having committed sin, or in other words, harming other persons, but he never harms anybody. So why should he ever have to experience the consequence of harming others when he never harms anyone? It wouldn't be fitting for him to have to do so. So it's not possible, nor would it be fitting for Bhagavan to have that direct experience. So Jiva Gosvami is saying, because he doesn't have that direct experience, he can't necessarily feel at heart a direct sense of oneness with those who are undergoing it, such that compassion for them in that state is evoked. Therefore, even though he is ever present everywhere and capable of doing, not doing, and doing otherwise, that is, even though he is the supreme independent conscious agent capable of any and all forms of action and non-action, there is no end to the affliction of samsara, the afflictions of samsara for those who are oblivious of him. So in other words, although he's completely capable of ending that suffering that people are going through in samsara, it's not ending. He could end it, he has every ability to do so, but yet he's not doing that. So he's present, he's capable, but he's not taking that action. So he takes no action to terminate the suffering and samsara of those oblivious of him, since there is no scope for grace specifically for them to arise in his heart, which would prompt him to take such action. Therefore, only the grace of the Sat remains. That is, the grace of the Sat, by the elimination of all other possibilities, is determined to alone be the primary cause of jivas in samsara acquiring or attaining intentness upon Bhagavan. So if Bhagavan's grace is not going to those persons, in other words, he's not bringing or revealing or creating awareness of himself in them, then how would they ever get awareness? The only other way that they would get awareness is from the people who already have that awareness, namely the bhaktas or the Sat. So then you might say, well, then the Sat would have to be able to have this compassion that Bhagavan doesn't have. They would also have to be suffering in samsara in order to have, if your argument is that you won't feel compassion unless you've had the experience for yourself, then you have to imply then that these bhaktas or these sadhus are also suffering in samsara and suffering from tamas, so they're also sinful and they're also ignorant. And then, how then are they the Sat? How then are they filled with awareness of Bhagavan or filled with bhakti for Bhagavan? This becomes a problem. So, anticipating that consideration, Jiva Gosvami says the following. although the Sat too are not touched by samsaric suffering, then. In other words, no, not like that. It's not that, they are still subject to that suffering, but yet, even though they're not subject to it, they can still be compassionate for it. How? Still, those who have awakened after sleeping may also sometimes remember a dream's having been filled with suffering. In other words, they used to experience that, they don't anymore, but they remember, they have the remembrance of what it's like to experience it, and that remembrance enables them to empathize or to have compassion for those who are actively going through it. And thus, that is, the Sat's grace comes upon even a sangsarika, just as Sri Narada's did upon Nalakubar and Manigriva. That is, the Sat's grace can come upon a worldly person should the Sat see a person suffering and happen to be reminded of their own past suffering in such a manner that their compassion for the person they observe to be suffering in samsara so happens to be evoked, and they thus of their own will wish to grace that person. So when and where will all of those factors come together at the same moment? Not always. Sometimes. Therefore, you get, a diversity of circumstances. Therefore, because of the absence of the suffering of the samsara being a cause thereof, that is, of grace, even in this analysis, that is, even in the case of grace coming from the Sat. In other words, just because you're suffering doesn't mean you're going to get mercy for that, or doesn't mean that necessarily anything is going to come from above for you just because you're in that state. This is what he wants to say. The grace of Parameshwara, rather, arises only in relation to bhakti constituted of humility, dainya, such as praying as follows, Sa eva mama sharanam. He, Bhagavan, is my only shelter here in this world. As in the case of Gajendra and others who prayed to Bhagavan for his shelter in this manner, and in contrast to the Denzians of Naraka and others who do not pray to Bhagavan, out of bhakti constituted of humility, as aforementioned. So you can even hear instances in the Puranas of Vishnu or other Mahatmas visiting Naraka. Like, did they not know that all these people are literally in hell? It's happening, but it's not ending. And here Jiva Gosvami is directly saying that the grace of Bhagavan doesn't come down on the people in hell, but it comes down on that person who says, you are my shelter. So it comes in reciprocation with awareness of him, with Sharanagati, with Dainya. This is what can evoke Bhagavan's grace. But where did that Sharanagati, where did that Dainya come from? It came from the Sat-sanga that someone had in the past. So once that drop, at the least, once that touch of awareness of Bhagavan comes to a person through the Sat, then their prayers, their calls, their etc., their seeking of Bhagavan, whatever their motivation may be, will elicit some grace, some response in Bhagavan. But that response from Bhagavan won't be out of necessarily compassion for the worldly suffering that they're undergoing, but rather in reciprocation with the samukya, the attentiveness to him that they're now showing, that they've acquired by the grace of a sadhu. But if persons who don't have that sadhu-sanga, don't have that awareness, don't have that humility, don't have that interest in taking his shelter, just suffer and just complain, or just wish that they weren't suffering, none of those things in and of themselves will lead to awareness of him or connection with him or the evocation of his grace. So, bhakti is a particular shakti of his, which is a melter of him, that is his heart, upon having entered the department of his bhaktas. Or here, department is, not like a store, but it just means it's like a philosophical way of saying like the entity of such category. I.e., bhakti is a shakti that belongs to Bhagavan and manifests the capacity to melt Bhagavan's heart, upon it entering the hearts of bhaktas, who are, as a, quote, separate department, that is, a type of entity that is possessed of distinction from him, do not possess bhakti in their essential nature, but upon receiving bhakti become impelled to perform acts of bhakti for Bhagavan that result in Bhagavan's heart becoming melted. This has been described in the Paramatma Sandarbha in a passage we discussed before, and will be described further ahead in Priti Sandarbha 65, which, for those who studied the text, have heard before. Furthermore, in connection with humility, or dainya, it becomes abundantly enkindled. This is a very important statement of Jiva Gosvami about the importance of humility. When bhakti is in connection with humility, it becomes abundantly enkindled. So Sanatana Gosvami elaborates on this in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, speaking about how bhakti and dainya have a mutual cause and effect relationship. So that's a very important subject, but outside the scope of our focus at this moment. Thus, there is an abundance of that therein, that is, in a bhakta who responds to distress with humility as a result of association with the Sat. So if someone has had association, they've acquired some mukhya, they enter a state of distress, then this evokes dainya, or this evokes a sense of heartache or a sense of being in need, and then moved by that need, they call out to Bhagavan, just as Gajendra did and just as is indicated in the Gita, where it describes the first person who worships Bhagavan as the arta, or the distressed person, according to Rupa Goswami's interpretation. Therefore, because Bhagavan's grace manifests directly only in response to bhakti, and never directly towards jivas oblivious of him who are devoid of bhakti, his grace, which dwells in the Sat, being either conveyed solely by association with the Sat, or conveyed solely by the grace of the Sat, is transmitted to another jiva from the Sat who are carrying it. Thus it is established that it is not independent, i.e., it is established that Bhagavan's grace is not transmitted to jivas in samsara directly, that is, independent of the Sat, but rather is transmitted to jivas in samsara only through the Sat. Okay, we're a little low on time, but I'll just finish this passage. So he quotes one more Bhagavatam verse to support his conclusion. So the Devas, when they praise Krishna as he's appeared in the womb of Devaki, say the following. O luminous one, after having fully crossed over the fearsome and difficult to traverse ocean of material existence and reached the shore themselves, they of abundant affection, which here is referring to the sadhus, have left the boat of your lotus feet here for others of the future to take shelter in, and so also reach the shore, since you are he whose grace is the Sat. And now I've given the gist of what comes next in the commentary here in the bracket. He whose grace comes to those in the ocean of material existence only through the Sat. So this verse gives support to what Jiva Goswami is saying, but again, it's a clever interpretation of a compound to establish the precedent. So he does this as follows. O luminous one means, O you who are self-manifest. So it's also interesting here that this very verse that's being quoted to say that it's only through the Sat that grace comes to jivas in samsara, that very same verse describes Bhagavan as being self-manifesting. So those two things are not contradictory. Rather, that Bhagavan is self-manifesting, but he's self-manifesting through this channel. They have left the boat of the form of which is your lotus feet here on the shore of the ocean of material existence. Means they have shown the means of crossing over the ocean of material existence for the people of posterity. In this regard, Bhagavan asks the Devas speaking this verse, well, why don't I show that myself? Why is there as though dependence upon them, that is the Sat, on my part in regard to showing the means by which one can cross over the ocean of material existence? Why do you say that they do it? Couldn't I have done it? To that they say, you are Sat Anugraha, So this, in that other verse, Jiva Goswami is commenting on Sat Gati. So now he comments on this compound, a name of Bhagavan, Sadanugraha, which he interprets as follows: he who graces others only by way of the Sat. Or alternately, he whose grace is the Sat themselves. Your grace moves about in the external world. Your grace, which moves about in the external world, moves only in that form, i.e., only as and through the Sat and not in any other form. This is the meaning. So this is Jiva Goswami's hammer, or his, concluding point, the gist of what he wants to say. The grace of Bhagavan comes in the world as and through the sadhus, and not otherwise. Even in an explanation of the name Sadanugraha as he whose grace is upon the Sat, as was given by Sri Samipad, because it is gathered that your grace is not upon the asat, that is, those who are oblivious of you, it certainly follows that manifestation thereof only through the Sat is befitting. So he adds this point just to fortify what he's saying. Okay, so I'll leave it at that for today. We didn't get through all the discussion of this verse. Looks like we'll have to give it more attention in the next discussion. But there's many very, very fine points that come or build up through this analysis. So we've heard how Krishna Bhakti Janmamul Hoy Sadhu-sanga, that the cause of the appearance of Krishna Bhakti is Sadhu-sanga. So, okay, and why is that? Because the sadhus bring awareness of Krishna, and that awareness gives rise to bhakti to him. And is Bhagavan involved in that? Yes, but secondarily and not directly. Even Bhagavan's grace, by which awareness of him comes about, comes to people through the channel of the Sat and not from Bhagavan directly. But once that bit of awareness from him, of him, has come to someone, then by their humility, by their prayer, by their expressions of bhakti, then the grace of Bhagavan flows towards that person directly, so to speak. Okay, so I'll conclude here for today. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or other feedback of any type, they're welcome to share.
Maharaj?
Yes.
Wouldn't the appearance of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu be an exception to this case? He directly appears and is extremely gracious and compassionate.
Yes. Yes, he appears as extremely gracious and compassionate, but how would it be an exception? Are you there?
I'm sorry, I lost the audio.
Oh, okay, now I hear you.
Did you hear me?
I just asked. I said that, yes, Mahaprabhu is very compassionate, but how would he be an exception to what's being said here?
Because it's the verse is saying that the Lord is not directly involved in distributing this mercy except through the sadhus. But it seems that when the Lord comes himself as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he is directly distributing the mercy.
Yeah, so two things we can say. One way we can say that what's being said here is a general principle which doesn't necessarily pertain specifically to when Bhagavan is performing an avatar, be it as Mahaprabhu or as another. And that and that generally someone would only be so blessed as to get to be born in that time and space where an avatar is taking place, if in their past life they've most likely had some sadhu-sanga, done some bhakti in the past. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it in the case of Mahaprabhu is that he's Krishna with bhakta bhav. So in that sense, you could say it's the bhakta bhav aspect of him that is making this possible, so to speak. So we can also see a consistency with what's said here in that respect.
Very nice. Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll go further into this wonderful analysis of Jiva Gosvami in the coming days and deepen our appreciation for Sadhu-sanga. Let that, let us, further cherish the Sadhu-sanga that we're blessed to have in our lives and inspire us to make the most of it as far as we're able. So with that, I'll conclude. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namo. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.